Thank you. I first want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, and I thank Uncle Shannon for his welcome to country. And I'd also like to recognise the traditional owners of the land where I work and live, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I feel truly privileged to live in a country which has such an amazing and ancient history, and I recognise that this land was never ceded. I also recognise that the title for this session is Communities Leading the Way, and I'm aware that I am not a member of any of the communities which we regularly speak of who are affected by HIV, but I do like to think of myself as a community ally, and I hope I can show some of the work that WHO does and supports with communities. I also want to describe a quite shocking event that happened to me last year. I turned 50, and I was also at this event recently. I was asked to talk to a group of very young and passionate public health researchers and workers, and it made me feel very old. And so if you will allow me an anecdote. This is a picture of Cambodia, of a beautiful festival they have there, a water festival. And I was thinking about my first job with WHO, which was in Cambodia almost 20 years ago. And at the time, I remember a project that we did with the National Centre for HIV/AIDS, NCHADS, about measuring the quality of pre-test counselling for HIV. We hired kind of undercover researchers who would pretend they needed an HIV test, go to the VCT clinic, sit through this pre-test counselling, and go through this very long, drawn-out process. And it was a drawn-out process. People had to wait weeks to get a result, and we made a very big deal of pre-test counselling. And at that time, of course, it made sense. Not everyone had access to treatment. HIV was seen by many as a death sentence. And also we didn't have access to rapid diagnostic tests. And so a big part of pre-test counselling was trying to ensure that people would come back for their results. But things, of course, have really changed. We saw yesterday a really fantastic session, and my colleague Lara Voinov presented this policy brief. We now know that HIV is not a death sentence. We can live a full life with HIV, and this great message that was given yesterday that if viral load is undetectable, there's zero chance of transmitting HIV. There's been she got so many rounds of applause. Another one for Lara, that's great. And so, yeah, we also have access to rapid diagnostic tests, and we have a lot more ways to reach people with testing. So I was going to say, I often think about that time and all the systems we built and all the scaffolding we built around HIV testing, and how now we spend a lot of time trying to unbuild that, to take the scaffolding down. And across WHO guidelines and recommendations, there really is a common theme of simplification, demedicalisation, and ways to increase access to a range of services across the HIV cascade. And then this also happened. We were all part of a massive experiment on self-testing. I'm sure everyone in this room did a COVID self-test. I'm sure everyone was able to perform that test adequately with just the information that was given in that test. And I'm sure many of us also distributed those COVID tests to our friends and community. And that was a secondary distribution of a self-test kit, which was not the end of the world. And I've included included this drawing here that my daughter did while she was waiting for the results of her rapid test. She was 9 years old. She performed that test many times perfectly. And this drawing, I'm not sure which one I felt more like, but I think we were all feeling a little bit like this. I was either the person with the runny nose and the sticking out tongue, or I was the freaking out test. But it was a tough time. One of the positive things that came out of it was, of course, a really better acceptance of self-testing. So we have this data that UNAIDS has been presented here already, and I've highlighted here the first 95, the proportion of people living with HIV that know their status. And we can see here globally it's 86%. But there's regional differences, particularly in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East and North Africa. And in our beautiful region here, we're also behind the global average for the proportion of people living with HIV who know their status. And just also, of course, those global figures often mask differences in populations. This from 2023 in the Lancet HIV, a really great systematic review looking at the estimated proportion of men who have sex with men in different African regions who are aware of their status. You can see clearly here there's great progress. The proportion is increasing in all regions, but it's way below what we see in other populations. So in Central and Western Africa, even in 2020, it's still less than 50% knowing their HIV status. So how can social networks help us to find people that don't know they have HIV and close that gap in the first 95? A social network is defined as a set of individuals linked by one or more specific types of relationships. And I'm sorry, this might be a little bit fuzzy and tiny, but this is work from Botswana, mapping out social networks of young women. And I really like this picture because, again, you might not be able to see the legend, but there's 3 different types of connections that these women have. Their information, so they ask women, where would you go to get information? Where would you go to for socializing? And where would you go to for emotional support? So just categorizing all these different types of ways that we relate to each other in social networks. And you can see here that there's some of these women were really like what we would call hubs. They were really well connected and they provided all 3 of these things to their peers. So we use this principle of social networks when we talk about social network approaches. This is just showing that we have had a long history, of course, of contact tracing and index testing. This is from New York in the 1930s. And again, I'm not sure if you can see, it's about a syphilis outbreak and mapping an index case and all the different cases of syphilis. And you can see down the bottom, there's these little dotted lines about normal sex contact, homosexual contact, or family and other contacts. And I can imagine that having to disclose this kind of information to your health provider in the 1930s was probably a difficult thing to do, quite a lot of stigma attached. And so with social network approaches and on this continuum of different ways that we use partner services to identify people, we have different levels of disclosure. And so on the sort of least intervention side, the number one, where it's just patient referral, we just have providers encouraging people to get tested, giving information and sites. And on the other side, we have provider-assisted referral, which in partner services is the most involved or supported by health or other providers, where providers ask people about their HIV and sexual and drug-injecting partners, and then with consent, they inform their partners of that potential exposure. And somewhere in the middle, we have social network testing, or social network approaches to testing, or social network services. There's quite a few different acronyms always is called. So that's when a trained provider asks people living with HIV or those who've tested HIV negative but are at ongoing risk, to encourage and invite their sexual, drug-injecting or social network to participate in a voluntary HIV test. And importantly, there's no emphasis here on disclosure of HIV status. And also importantly, it's not just about people who are living with HIV identifying their sexual contacts. It's about using a social network of both people at risk of HIV and people living with HIV. I'm going to give some examples of different social network approaches to HIV testing. This is from South Africa. It's young women between the ages of 18 and 24 reaching out to other young women in their social networks with HIV testing and linkage to PrEP. And it's you can see these different clusters. I think the important thing to see here is that we start out with about 8 peer navigators. They recruited 55 female seeds, and from that we see that we're able to reach 216 incentivized recruitments and distribute 1,585 HIV self-tests. So from 8 to 1,585. And you can see as well here in the different clusters that different networks have different lengths, and some kind of finish quite early and others go for a very long time, like the one down the bottom. And those of us that have worked in epidemiology really recognize this as well as like a snowball sampling or respondent-driven sampling approach that we use in order to reach hidden populations. But in respondent-driven sampling, one of the biases that we worry about is that recruits and then we have a selection bias. Of course, in social network approaches to testing, this is actually what we're looking for. We're looking for like to find like. Another example here, this is an ongoing research in Malawi where fishermen who are at increased risk of HIV are reached by a peer navigator who provides HIV self-tests to one boat, and then within the boat they're distributing those HIV tests within their networks of fishermen. That's a really nice model, I think, and this is ongoing work. Hopefully we'll see some more results from this soon. And then this just from Vietnam, something in our region, just showing that, what they've done here is they've mapped the hotspots. That's the little flame. That's the physical hotspots that they've mapped. And then they also, on top of this, they mapped out Grindr users and Bluid users, another dating app. And just really showing when you layer that kind of physical networks with online networks of people, that you can reach so many more people. And they do, in Vietnam, do amazing work distributing self-test kits along these networks and through various different ways, online and also physical. The WHO had previously recommended social network-based approaches to testing, specifically for key populations. That was in 2019. This year, we're updating that recommendation to be for all populations, not just key populations. And in order to update that recommendation, of course, WHO undertakes an evidence review, or we contract out an evidence review actually, and this was done by Dr. Jason Ong at the Monash University. And basically what he found was an increase of HIV testing, an increase in the number of first-time testers, and an increase in the number of new HIV diagnoses with no negative effects and increased equity. But there's several considerations. Obviously, this works better if HIV self-testing is also distributed at the same time as these networks are meeting new people. A longer duration, like letting the network run for a longer time, gives better outcomes. Using community-based test promoters. And importantly, we found that financial incentives were not needed in order to make this a successful approach. And in fact, financial incentives were seen by some as being inequitable because we can't offer financial incentives for every intervention, and it's not needed. So the Guidelines Development Group wanted to include this consideration about financial incentives. I urge you to go and see the results of this systematic review, which will be on the 26th of July at the Late Breakers Track C. So Jason will be presenting that then. Of course, HIV testing is the first step to HIV treatment, and I want to quickly talk about as well HIV treatment. And this is a really simple scheme of a network. The blue are people living with HIV, and the white are people not living with HIV but connected. And you can see the little arrows are where the HIV transmission has occurred between two people. And then this is not news to anyone, of course, but if we treated this person here and we reduced their viral load so there was no more transmission, we don't have any onward effect. We've treated one person, and of course that's really important that we treat that one person. But if we treat this person in the middle, if we really think about where we're targeting our HIV testing and treatment, we have an ongoing population effect which is much bigger than treating and testing people who are outliers. And this is just another way to look at this. This research is a little old, from 2014, but I found it a really interesting paper, and there's also a YouTube video that goes along with this paper, which is really interesting, where they made this calculation called the TNS, or transmission network score, to show people's connectedness and likelihood to transmit HIV. And then they modeled, what would happen in this on the right-hand side if you just treat someone who's on the outside of the network, who doesn't have a very high TNS score. You don't have a lot of ongoing effect. You have a local effect only. But if you treat people who have a very high TNS, then you have a much bigger population effect. And I know this is not news to anyone here. This is basic epidemiology. And then also this is another from Lara's presentation, and I found this really interesting, and that what she said was that, basically 75% of people living with HIV at the moment, we would put in that category where they're not able to transmit HIV to their sexual partners. But the ones that are outside of that 75%, so many of them are those people that are undiagnosed. It's really, to me, a call that we find that, we help people to get onto treatment. And the first step of that, of course, is knowing that you have HIV. So we know all this. We know we should target treatment. We know testing, and we know that there's a lot of people who remain undiagnosed. But unfortunately, what we see is that there's still not a great investment in targeted testing. This paper is from AMFAR, and it's showing investments from PEPFAR in 2018 and 2019. And so what they've done here is they've mapped out the target, like the number of key populations, and then the number of all populations that were targeted to be reached with the PEPFAR funding. And you can see in 2018, say for key populations, that was around 670,000. They changed this target in 2019. They doubled it almost, so it's 1,270,000. So there was a massive increase in the testing target for key populations. But actually, when they also mapped how much was of PEPFAR funding was spent at the country level on testing for key populations, that amount had decreased. And this little chart down the bottom with the bars is probably explaining a little bit what this is. Again, it's so tiny, but I'll tell you that the dark brown line is basically the money, those organisations which are not key population focused. They're not community led, they're not key population organisations. And this is showing how much of the funding they got. And you can see that in 2019, they got almost half the funding that was for testing for key populations was given to those organisations which were not community based and were not key population focused organisations. So this is from our WHO Key Population Guidelines, which we launched last year. I was looking at this again, and I was looking at it more with a social network lens, and I was really thinking that what we did when this is the framework basically that WHO works with key populations, and you can see at the top what we have is criminalisation, punitive restrictive policies, stigma, and then we have these kind of interconnected things, intersectionalities, gender, race, disability, poverty. And if we think about it like a social network, if we could imagine, if we could eliminate criminalisation, if we could eliminate stigma, then the downward effect of that would have a reduction in HIV, viral hepatitis and STI incidents. And that's indeed what we find from the evidence. But these barriers, of course, as we all know, persist. I want to talk a little bit about self-care as well. WHO has guidance on self-care. This is a living guidance, which is really exciting, so it's constantly being updated, which is great. They define self-care as the ability of individuals to promote health, prevent disease, maintain health and cope with illness and disability with or without the support of a healthcare provider. And this guideline includes recommendations about self-management of medical abortion. In Australia, actually, we've recently had some legislative change, which is going to mean that there's much greater access to self-managed abortion for women, which is great news. The guidelines also include recommendations about self-sampling for HPV and self-sampling for other STIs, and also self-administration of injectable contraception. And there's many recommendations, and I would urge you to have a look at this guideline. So community empowerment, and this is how we defined it in the key population guidelines, means increasing communities' control over their health by addressing structural constraints to health, human rights and well-being, and making social, economic and behavioural changes, and improving access to health services. If we look at this graphic from the self-care guidelines, that really shows about how self-care interventions grounded in human rights can promote autonomy, informed participation of individuals, privacy, availability, access, and increased options. I really think that self-care can be incredibly empowering, and when we take a self-test and we put it into the hand of the community and we really promote social network-based approaches to testing, I think this could easily be part of a community empowerment approach. We have some upcoming WHO guidelines. We have updated recommendations on HIV self-testing and social network approaches that will be out probably later this year. We also have recommendations about partner services for STIs, including social network approaches, also probably coming out later this year. And excitingly, we have recommendations coming up for syphilis self-testing, and planning at the moment for looking into hepatitis B self-testing as well. Of course, I want to end by just saying, with all of this, we can't forget the 5 C's of testing, which is consent, confidentiality, counselling, giving the correct result and connections or linkages to treatment. And I also want to highlight in the global health sector strategies for HIV, hepatitis and STIs, one of the main cross-cutting strategies is to engage empowered communities and civil society. So thank you, and just some acknowledgements. The team at the HIV, hepatitis and STI global programs, all of them, but particularly Rachel Bagley, Maggie Barty, Chiara and Cheryl Johnson, Monash University and Jason Ong. I am grateful to others for sharing their slides, and I want to remember Glenn Thomas, who was in the plane that was shot down on his way to Melbourne in 2014. He was a member of the same team I'm a member of, and he was coming here to be part of the launch of the first consolidated key population guidelines. Thank you.